Hello, and thank you for joining us today at the SPSP Town Hall, Social Psychological Considerations of the Racism Pandemic. We will be turning off the chat function shortly. You can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen for questions. We also want to remind everyone of the Society for Personalized Social Psychology's Code of Conduct, and that we're committed to providing a friendly, safe, and discrimination and harassment-free environment for all attendees, including on online virtual environments. You can find the full statement at the meeting site, meeting.spsp.org under Code of Conduct, or you can visit spsp.org and search Code of Conduct to find the full Code of Conduct. I will now turn this program over to our moderator, Denise Sekaquaptewa. Denise, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Annie. And thank you all for joining us here today. I'm Denise Sekaquaptewa, Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I also serve on the executive board of SPSP as a member at large for science programs. And I previously served SPSP as chair of the Diversity and Climate Committee. So before we begin, I'd like to provide some context for the motivation and the goals for today's forum. SPSP President-elect Dr. Monica Burnett described it to me this way. SPSP leadership has been seeking ways to reach out to our community in these troubled and troubling times. As a field, we have considerable expertise and understanding in group relations broadly and anti-racism in particular. This doesn't mean that we are immune from racial and other biases within our practices, training, science, and everyday lives. Like many organizations and institutions across the country and the world, we are prompted to commit anew to seeking ways to reduce bias and improve the lives of our Black colleagues and other colleagues of color in the field. Bringing together a group of scholars to talk about our science and our field and to answer questions from our members seemed like an important service that we could offer in the midst of the racism pandemic. We sought to assemble a group of panelists who have research, teaching, and outreach expertise, as well as some panelists who have practice experience in leading diversity offices on campuses. We also sought to represent the full range of career stages of SPSP membership in our panel, from graduate students to distinguished emeritus faculty. Each panelist brings unique knowledge, experience, and perspective, and they're here to share their thoughts and to speak to questions and ideas that you all raised today. We hope this panel on the racism pandemic serves as a starting point for more collaborative conversations and efforts towards positive change. So we'll start today with introductions by our panelists, and then we'll move on to our discussion questions. Some of these questions were submitted by the SPSP Student Committee, and some of them, of course, will be submitted by you all in the audience today. So please feel free to submit your questions as we go along. So now I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and say a sentence or two about their research programs. We'll go in alphabetical order, beginning with Patricia Devine. There you go.
First point, I have to unmute myself. So hi, everybody. I'm Trish Devine. I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been here for about 35 years, so that puts me in the age category of a seasoned veteran doing research. The issue that I've worked on throughout the course of my career is why people respond in biased ways that they don't intend and wish that they didn't. They may have values prescribing prejudice and then yet find themselves vulnerable to responding in unintentional kinds of ways. I've used a habit of mind framework to understand the origins and persistence of bias, and then use that same metaphor to try to figure out how to help people become empowered to prevent the expression of bias and to create more inclusive environments. And if questions come up about that, I'll be happy to share much more about my work in that regard.
Great, thank you, Trish. Kristin?
Hello, my name is Kristin Dukes. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the Dean for Institutional Diversity at Allegheny College, which is the Senior Diversity Officer of the college. Prior to that, I was an Associate Professor of Psychology at Simmons University, and my research interest lies in stereotyping, prejudice, and social justice. The most recent and most relevant work would be an issue of the Journal of Social Issues that I co-edited on police violence against racial and ethnic minorities.
Great, thank you. Now to James. Oh, unmute James. Yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
So I'm an emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Delaware, where I've been since 1981. And I began writing the first edition of Prejudice and Racism in June of 1970, 50 years ago. And what I was trying to do then was to capture what I felt was going on through the 60s and before, that history matters. We couldn't understand where we were in 1970 without understanding how we got there. And second, that individuals could have biases, but the real problem was institutional and cultural. So I talk about individual racism, institutional racism, and cultural racism, which taken together through their interactions and dynamics represent, I think, what we now generally call systemic racism. So I've been writing about that ever since, and I'm particularly interested in the cultural component because that's harder to grasp, but I think it's, in the end, it is the most pernicious and most significant aspect of the problem.
Great, thank you, James. Now to Rob.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Sellers. I am a professor of psychology here at the University of Michigan and the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, also here at the University of Michigan. My research focus is focused on the role of race in the psychological lives of African Americans, in particular issues of racial identity, racial socialization processes, and experiences of racial discrimination and how that impacts the life chances of African Americans.
Great, thank you, Rob. Now to Kamiya.
Hi everyone, my name is Kamiya Stewart. I'm a PhD student at Tulane University. My research broadly focuses on prejudice and discrimination. I'm particularly interested in uncovering specific contexts in which marginalized populations have good outcomes despite experiencing discrimination. I also facilitate conversations on social justice and community engagement topics.
Great, thank you, Kamiya. And now to Linda.
Thank you and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for taking time to join us today. I'm Linda Trupp. I'm a professor of social psychology at UMass Amherst, and most of my research focuses on contact and relations between groups, and I'm particularly interested in looking at groups that occupy different status positions in society and thinking about how members of these groups perceive, experience, and understand their relations with each other, oftentimes in different ways, or how their perceptions and experiences might diverge, and what this means for our efforts to try to promote intergroup equality on the one hand and improved intergroup relations on the other.
Great, thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. Just to say a bit about me, I'm an experimental social psychologist at the University of Michigan, where my research program has focused on implicit stereotyping, implicit biases, and the experiences of women and people who from groups that are underrepresented in science and engineering. So great, so now that we all know each other, let's turn to our discussion questions. And those of you listening on or watching online, please feel free to just jump in there and enter your questions into the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. But I'll start with a general question to our panel, a rather broad question. What do you think are the most important insights or contributions made towards understanding racism by social and personality psychologists? And to extend on that, what are the most important things that we don't yet know? Linda, yes.
Well, you know, since James already mentioned it, like I mean, honestly, I like where I start was with James Jones' 1972 book on prejudice and racism that I read. You know, there's a newer edition for everybody out there listening. And you know, thinking about that in conjunction with some of Jen Richardson and colleagues' recent work distinguishing between interpersonal and structural forms of racism. And I find myself thinking a lot about how it'd be useful for us to try to relate that work to other research that we have on motivated social perception and how there are oftentimes different motivations and goals for cross-group interactions or cross-group relations among members of dominant and minoritized groups. So for example, to explore how members of dominant or historically advantaged groups might initially be inclined to think about racism in more interpersonal terms precisely because they're most concerned about being perceived as racist or reaffirming their moral integrity, as people like Nurit Schnabel and Aryeh Nadler might say, whereas members of minoritized or historically disadvantaged groups might initially be inclined to think about racism in more structural or systemic terms because they're more motivated to change the social structure and address structural inequalities or be motivated to be empowered and have influence, according to Schnabel and Nadler's model. So those are some of the first things that come to mind for me, but I'd love to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because it really means that members of dominant and disadvantaged groups are coming into their interactions from totally different places, making for an awkward interaction or one that just doesn't work, you know, at worst. Any other comments on that or other input?
You know, I think that we know a lot of things about, I think this speaks to Linda's point. We know a lot of things about what specific individuals or individual representatives of groups think, but we haven't really stepped back to try to figure out what these different perspectives mean when you bring people together, which I think is what Linda is encouraging. And I think this moment in time requires we step back and think about our science differently, and that we think about what we need to have represented that would truly allow different perspectives to be incorporated. And that ranges from different authors, different participant populations, different people participating in the science from a very early age on through different levels in the academy, playing roles as editors, reviewers, and you know, we're probably not in a position where we're prepared to fully do that yet, which leads us to step back and say, what things do we need to do to allow full participation? And that's something I think it's valuable to think about. I could point to particular findings we have that are really interesting and thought-provoking, but I think we're at a moment in time where we have to step back in time to think about some of the things James was talking about back in you know, the 1970s, because those issues weren't solved and we're facing them now, but I think more open to looking at them and looking at ourselves and our science more critically in a way that may produce some of the change that he was calling for early back in the day, as James and I would say.
How about things that we don't know? I think what are the most important things that are out there, questions that haven't been well enough understood and investigated?
So to just pipe up, to continue off of Trisha's idea there, I think we also need to pay close attention to intersecting identities that for a long time as a discipline, we wanted to keep our science so clean that this varying just two variables at a time and being in that beautiful 2x2 design. I mean, we all love it. We love the simple interaction. But in that we've lost much of the nuance, and that there are categories of people. I mean, I think about Amanda Sesko's work on Black women going unheard and unseen, and some of the other work on intersectional invisibility. That needs to be expanded, that Black people in this country, Black people globally, are not a monolithic group, that we have different perspectives, that we are experiencing the world in different ways, that we're being perceived in different ways, and that we're missing that nuance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've heard that the intersectionality perspective, as you just raised it, in terms of intersections of race and gender. So, Kristin, do you think that there are other intersections that are equally influential in people's lives that we haven't been talking about enough?
Gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status. Although socioeconomic status is so hard to measure because it's so many things conflated, but the experience of a well-off, wealthy Black family now and the experience of someone that is working class, it's very different. We could talk about that in terms of COVID-19 or a number of things, that those are areas, even age, talk about a generational gap and divide in the way that we're perceiving and understanding the world. And all of those identities need to be looked at. And to add to that, I mean, I know we're experimentalists and we're really about the quantitative data, but some of this is qualitative work and different ways of knowing that we have to embrace as being valid and part of knowledge.
Great. Anything else anyone wants to add?
I'm frozen out here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, James.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got frozen. I'm just now getting back.
Okay.
I don't know where you are. I do.
We were just talking about the most important things that haven't really been answered regarding racism by social psychologists.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is important, we talk about systemic racism, but our science is fundamentally at the individual level. I don't think we have figured out as well as we might how to connect individual psyches to institutional practices and cultural norms and values. I think we've done a lot of it, we know a lot. One of the ideas that is really significant to me is the idea that not only does culture provide prescriptive information that is at the source of implicit bias that we internalize cultural norms, but also our behavior is a bottom-up influence on our cultural norms themselves. And in my model, I talk about how individuals are socialized by institutions which are directed by culture and vice versa. And over time, the cultural transformations that occur because of what people do. And I think that where we are right now is in a moment where protests are driving new behaviors. New behaviors are shaping new cultural attitudes or beliefs, and those beliefs will in turn shift attitudes. So I think for me, we don't know how all that works exactly, and I think Trish said earlier about needing new paradigms, not only in terms of interpersonal relationships, but in terms of this bottom-up, top-down sort of approach. I'm thinking of John Castiapo's multi-level analysis applied to this kind of problem would be a very useful way to try to think about it.
Mm-hmm. We'll move on to some of the questions that have been submitted, and one of them maybe a little connected to the topic we were just on. There's a question submitted by Lisa. Thank you for your question, Lisa. How do you think the current racism pandemic climate, which includes both heightened awareness of modern white supremacy, as well as a large anti-racism protest movement, will change and influence the way we study prejudice and intergroup relations? What needs to change and what new constructs will become important?
Lisa, thanks for starting with an easy question. You're sort of putting the you're hitting the nail on the head, or whatever the metaphor is, because I think that part of what may be happening in this moment is an increased willingness for people to recognize that whether they thought they did or not, intended to or did or not, have been participating in a system that perpetuates bias. Right? I think for a long time, people intellectually kind of understood that, but I think that now with what's transpired in recent events and the kind of collective conscience about these issues, that people have started to believe that they could be participating in systems the way that James was talking about them, that lead them to be complicit, however unwittingly, in these systems that provide advantages for some groups over others. And so I'm not sure we actually have to change all of the constructs. We have to recognize that they apply. We have to accept that they apply. We have to understand the ways that they apply, and we have to acknowledge that that the status quo is unacceptable. That the status quo will just leave things as they always were. So that what that means is we have to upend our own thinking. We have to recognize that there's a lot of hard work to do and try to identify those arenas, not just our science. Our science will have to change to be more inclusive of the perspectives that Kristin was talking about, and perhaps use a broader set of methods to acknowledge the complexity of the issues that we talked about. I once wrote that for a science that was interested in intergroup relations, our approach was remarkably intrapersonal. And so we just had to get to the interpersonal level, but James is challenging us to recognize the way in which those persons participate in systems that perpetuate bias. But if they perpetuate bias, they can learn to challenge bias. And we have to enlist people to become agents of change. I talk about agents of change in my own work in terms of individual level regulation of bias. But to James's point, I actually have been able to observe that people become agents of change in their social context, in academic units within departments, which lead to different hiring practices, adjusting the culture and climate within departments. So I think it's partly just recognizing that a lot of what we have been studying is relevant. We have to put it all together in the way that Kristin and James are challenging us to. It'll be a more exciting science in the end, rather than studying only what happens inside the head. Not that that's all we do. We do lots of other things, but there's a lot of the studies of stereotyping, implicit bias, and so forth that has looked at what transpires in the head. Linda demands we come and we think about people in contact, right? But now we've got to put people in systems and understand how systems and individuals, that dynamic between them.
Apropos of what you're just saying, I believe that there is a kind of a construct that would be useful. It's not a construct, but a way of thinking.
Sorry, James, I think we're losing your audio a little bit. Maybe I could ask Annie if she could help with James's audio. So, sorry, but to keep things moving, can someone else kind of chime in if they have more to say on this topic until we can get James's audio back online?
So I'd like to jump in now. I guess I'm, forgive me, I'm feeling a little less optimistic than I might otherwise feel. I think the question with regards to who we are as social and personality psychologists is very much consistent with the challenge that we face as a larger society. We have to literally, in my mind, blow up what we do. We start off from a framework where when I was coming up as a personality psychologist, the only place I saw in mainstream American Western psychology, Black folks were as either victims of stigma or examples of underdevelopment. And no matter whether it was victims of stigma from the perspective of a very liberal approach that was very progressive in the sense that it wanted to address issues of injustice, but still defined African Americans as deficit, or from a more dark place that wanted to define African Americans as inherently deficient. But no matter what, you ended up with African Americans as somehow being less human. Much of the focus is still in that particular perspective. The nature of the questions that we ask look very differently if you're looking from it from a different perspective. There's a reason why much of our early work focused on in this area on prejudice and stereotyping and other psychological forms from the perspective of those who viewed African Americans and other groups in a way that was, again, not understanding the nuanced experience and the nuanced humanity of the folks that they're studying. And I guess I'm less optimistic than when I came in to this field. So at least when we came into the field, social psychology was connected in some ways to sociology, and at least had a space to understand issues of structure and issues of culture and issues even of history, which were almost completely devoid. But over the past 30 years, we have gone more and more inward, not only to the individual, but now everything's in the brain. If it's not an image, then it's not a value. We've focused our approach to enhancing internal validity without any view towards external validity. I liken it to losing your keys in a dark place, but only searching for it in the light because you're afraid you're going to bump your head. The reality is the answer is not in our highly controlled, highly sophisticated methodology. The sad truth is it's out there where the messiness and the darkness resides. And it has to happen from a place of also understanding, first and foremost, the humanity of the folks that we're studying. If the only person that we know who looks like the people that we're studying is our fellow graduate students, and we have a problem. And that's even if you are an African-American graduate student. If the only other African-Americans that you really know anything about is your family and your other colleagues, that's a problem. We're not getting to truly understand the problem. So if we're serious about this, we have to blow this whole thing up. We have systems that are in place, and we can talk about more, that are fundamental examples of what structural racism, sexism, any other ism is, that are foundational to who we are and what we are as a science, as a society, as a psychological society. And what I would say is, if we're serious, then it's not a reformable issue. It is literally rethinking what we're about. And I don't think that we're there. I wish that was the case, but I just don't think we as a larger society is at that space. So I hope we are able to move forward in some progress, but yeah, so I throw that out there.
Yes, thanks, Rob. And that's related to a question that came in anonymously, which is in light of what Dr. Jones noted about how our science is inherently focused on individual differences and yet racism is a systemic issue, is our focus on reducing prejudice at the individual level sufficient? Should we move towards a science that incorporates the system level variables that influence such behaviors? And I think that's related to this discussion that we're having of the intra versus the inter personal focus. Let's see, maybe perhaps Kamiya, did you have something you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I do. And I think this also relates to the second question of like, as a science, what can we do like going forward? What's lacking? And so just thinking about like now there's all these system and organizational level new initiatives that are going, these diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, this anti-racist or racism training. We have prejudice reduction interventions. And at this like, system level and organization. And so now it's really important that we don't only just like, implement these initiatives or change policies or anything, but we're also evaluating them. We're making sure that, that we are getting the outcomes that we want to get, the outcomes that are outlined based on whatever we have with this type of training or prejudice reduction or anti-racism. And so I do like as a field, moving beyond thinking about individual and internalized, instances of racism and going to more of a systemic level.
And Linda, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and in some ways I kind of see it as a mixed response to both what Rob was saying and what Kamiya was saying as well. I really want to take a moment and highlight again some of the things that I heard Rob say, because when I heard the question from Lisa about how the waves of anti-racism protests are heightening our consciousness about systemic racial inequalities, or I guess I should qualify that by saying, emphasizing it for white people, I suspect people of color have been thinking about these issues a lot more than we have as white people. One of the things that really came to mind for me was that above and beyond any effects that these recent protests are having, I think the shifts in the nature of the research questions that we're asking has really grown because we've had faculty and colleagues of color coming through the ranks. And I think about this a lot, just in terms of the types of research questions we ask or don't ask, and how new perspectives, or how recent it has been to focus on the perspectives of non-white communities in our field. And what I often talk about in my undergraduate classes on prejudice is, as exactly as Rob was saying, the 1950s, all ports, nature of prejudice, right? There was so much of a focus on why members of dominant groups are prejudiced and what we can do to reduce that prejudice. And then in the 1980s and 90s, there was a emergent focus on stigma and the experience of being a target of prejudice. But so much of that work, as valuable and useful as it is, so much of that work focused on being a target of prejudice in terms of self-esteem, in terms of psychological well-being. And it was only really in the 2000s with work by Shelton and Richardson, some of the work that I and others have done, where we started studying members of minoritized groups as full interactants in those intergroup encounters, who form their own perceptions and attitudes and behavioral intentions and actions in relation to members of the dominant group. And I think having done that work, and especially I think recognizing that narrative or that trajectory of how research has evolved, I think we may be at a better place to begin thinking about how to incorporate working towards social change and active participation in protest movements and what motivates that. And I know, at least those of us in the contact literature, we've been trying to do just that, especially in light of critiques that, focusing on contact as a prejudice reduction strategy is limited. It might be missing the real issue if the real issue is promoting social change. So now a lot of people are starting to look at, so to what extent can we push the envelope? Think about contact and manifestations of intergroup experience, promoting changes in policy support, protest behavior on the behalf of historically disadvantaged groups. So try to, move the bounds of what we've typically thought of as the prejudice literature. So I just wanted to throw that out there in relation to the broader discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and that's great because you hit on some points that there were questions that coming in that did talk about the value of the contact hypothesis and whether that is what more can we do beyond improving intergroup contact, and I think your input is sort of getting more at that issue. I just wanted to test James and see if we have your audio back. Can you
you hear me?
Yeah, good, great. I'm glad you're back.
It keeps going in and out. Hopefully it'll last for a while.
Okay. Yeah, before I started, it was my worst fear that all my internet was going to go away. Yeah. Hopefully that won't happen. Let me look back to go on to another question, and there's so many interesting ones coming in, but one I think is, find it here again. It's gaining a lot of votes, so I think it's a good one to turn to. It is this question submitted anonymously about journals. Some of the mainstream or top journals desk reject papers focusing on Black and Indigenous people and people of color, noting that these papers seem more appropriate for, quote, specialty journals. Many social psychology and other programs do not value specialty journals when reviewing faculty for tenure or when hiring faculty. The rejection of this kind of work by mainstream journals and the devaluation of specialty journals during hiring and promotion processes sends a clear message about the value or lack thereof of this work. What will be done to address this issue?
Can I start? Because it actually has to do with something I was going to say based on what Rob had to say about blowing this whole thing up. There's some work that we have to do as an organization to align our values with what we're saying. So if we really, truly embrace and value this work by Black, Indigenous people, people of color, about those people, then we have to promote it and value it in that way. And in order to do that, we have to dismantle the entire academy, the entire system, the way that we value publications, the way that we look at tenure and promotion, the way that we value different types of institutions. All of that has to be flipped from the ground level if we're really gonna walk this walk. And that's a lot of hard work. I think as scientists, we've managed to sanitize these topics, kind of what Rob was getting at. It isn't messy anymore. We've sanitized it and intellectualized it and taken the humanity out of it. And we're gonna have to bring that back in and then also value that, because some science is messy. Some science has emotion, and that's okay. So until we as an org are able to value different types of institutions, be it a research intensive or a small liberal arts college, until those are seen as level, until we're able to say that that qualitative study about Black women or Black queer women is just as important as that 6-study sequence that tested the mechanism and rerouted the mechanism and did all of those mediations. Until we're able to do that as an organization, we get nowhere. The people on the outside aren't going to listen to us until we clean our own house. How can we share our science with other people when we've got stuff to take care of ourselves? So, sorry, I'm a little passionate about that.
No, that's really important. And I think that this change that you're speaking of has to be made at the same time as there's other movements in our field, for example, about you have to publish studies with these huge amounts of power, right? And huge sample sizes. And that's becoming more of the standard when that kind of leaves out, I think, studies of underrepresented populations. I mean, I myself have done research trying to study Black women in majoring in engineering, you know, and I'm plugged away at this for years and realizing I'm never going to achieve the sample size to bring those women into an experiment in the lab that would be publishable in a mainstream social psych journal. It just, when you only have in the population every year like 16 such women, you know, you're never going to get there. So yeah, I think there's different forces definitely contributing to making that kind of change you're speaking of, you know, a little more challenging. Let's see. I think
Rob was going to
Kristin
say something, I think.
Kristin or Rob?
So this is the perfect example. As a matter of fact, I have a presentation to do next week with our Board of Regents, and looking for example, I sent out to my networks asking people to give me examples of institutional racism to try to in higher education. This is the perfect textbook example of structural, institutional, even cultural racism. It's not about individuals. So we have a system that inherently devalues certain knowledge, certain individual, certain questions, not necessarily out of prejudice or conscious or even unconscious bias. It's a system that's set up that says, of course, the best scholarship is done with the tightest of rigor. And of course, that best scholarship is published in the journals that are the best journals. And we know they're the best journals because the individuals with the highest citations are publishing in those journals, and those are the most highly cited articles. And of course, the articles are the best way to do it because it is highly published. And of course, I'm going to get grant funding because I'm doing a study that is going to likely be published in the top journals. And of course, I'm going to end up getting tenure because I am publishing in the top journals with the highest citations. And of course, I'm going to have the best graduate students in my particular university because we're hiring the top people defined that way. And the graduate students who come to our institution, of course, are the best graduate students because they're coming to our institution, and they're also getting letters from our colleagues who are the best colleagues in the field. And of course, when they go out to get jobs, they're going to get jobs because they've come from the best place. It has nothing to do with race. It has absolutely nothing to do with race. We're 9,000 miles away from anybody's particular racial attitude, but we have a system that is completely, totally that way. And what's really scary is some of us benefit. I've benefited from that system. I would not have gotten an interview in my first job had you changed one word in my CV. If you had, instead of saying the University of Michigan, you had said Michigan State. And this is no diss to Michigan State, or if you'd said Eastern Michigan, or you just changed literally one word. And the reason why I know that is because I also ended up going there and seeing exactly that same case. And so as a clearly African-American male, I benefited from a system that is systemic with respect to its racism. So if you look at what are our top programs, that top quote unquote tiers, there's not a whole lot of us that are there. So if we're only fishing in those buckets, then, and it's, again, no one has to actually do anything for it to continue to perpetuate itself. And that's the reason why when I say we need to blow this up, it's because this system isn't about us as a larger group and what our biases and prejudices are. And I think that's important work, don't get me wrong. But if we don't understand how systemic racism happens, we can have all of the quote unquote woke folk in the world and still end up with the same kinds of disparate outcomes that we've had for the past 400 plus years. And so we need to really start thinking about, because ultimately it's about power. Are we willing to redistribute resources, give up resources? It's very easy, it feels comfortable to talk about it in terms of our attitudes and our beliefs, but it's something different when you start talking about our pocketbooks and our status and our privilege. Are we willing to give that up? And I don't know, this is where my pessimism comes in, or my, some might say realism comes in. I'm not sure that this is the moment that that's going to happen. I hope to God it is, and we will work to push as much as we can, but the size of the problem is much bigger than a bit of reform or tweaking around the edge.
Great. I think that both Kamiya and James would like to chime in here, but before they do, I just wanted to check in with the audience to say that our session today is scheduled until, or is a 90-minute session. So right now we're a little more than halfway through. So if you're a little worried about your question, not being able to be answered, we have still have some time. So we'll try to get to as many as we can. Yeah, go ahead, Kamiya.
Yeah, James, sorry, you've been waiting a little bit longer. Do you want to go first? Yeah.
Need to unmute.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate that. One thing that occurs to me is that blow it up we need to, but we also need to infiltrate. And I think both of those dynamics are important. I've been around for so long, I got a lot of history. But when we came out in the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of us Black psychologists, social psychologists, developmental psychologists, found the academy unreceptive to the kinds of problems that were important for us to study. And as a result, we built parallel processes. We built other journals. We built other research program, and Rob knows this well because he's carried on some of this. Research Directions of Black Psychology, we published a book that described the research that many of us had done that was not publishable for all the reasons Rob has articulated in mainstream journals. So we did all that, and that was important. But also, I think it's important because Rob did a pioneering piece of work on racial identity and published it in JPSP, both theoretically and empirically. So in my mind, that's the infiltration piece of it. The field has defined the problems so relatively narrowly, based largely on the kind of methodology that we can feel is rigorous enough. And even that methodology is getting beat up by our colleagues. So we have to somehow make the problems that we are talking about, problems that are fundamental to the work that psychology does, that social psychology does. And if I were to challenge SB in some way, it would be, how can you as an organization make those problems fundamental to what social psychology is, not a special case or a special problem, but it's fundamental. What is resilience? What is adaptation? What is coping? All those things that we've been writing about for years. How do people who are marginalized and oppressed manage? How come we're still here? after 400 years. And you go back and look at history, say, wow, man, we are really resilient people. So, and there's something to be learned from that in this system. And when the going gets tough, I remember when we had the gas shortage, people freaked out. They freaked out completely because they couldn't get gas. And they were running around like chickens with their head cut off. And we're used to not being able to get stuff. And so how do you cope? How do you deal with it? How do you make it possible to pursue a life when all the cards are not in alignment or arrayed for you? And that is a human resilience that would be very important for us as a field to understand better. So I think we need to convert some of these questions from, oh, what do we do about this protest over here, to talking about how do we change society? And the protest is not just a protest, it's a means, it's a lever for fundamental social change. And that social change then changes all sorts of other things that are not possible today. The Confederate flag and NASCAR, are you kidding me? How does that happen? That's a major consequence of the forces that have been unleashed in this moment. And I think as long as we see that, we see, well, here are some examples of how we can leverage the energy, the spirit, the feelings that are ongoing to really create fundamental change. Because once you get rid of the Confederate flag and you march behind Bubba Wallace, you can't go back to what you were. So we've got a fundamental change in our society just on that front. And when the Washington football team and the other teams change their names and so on, it'll be a different society, and other things that weren't possible become possible. So I think that SPSP can lead the charge in rethinking how we think about these things as fundamental to what our discipline is, not as a special moment for us to look at this.
Great. Kamiya?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to quickly add is a lot of the things we're touching upon is we're seeing how white supremacy culture is embedded within academia. So who defined what success means, that we should value publications over mentorship, over community engagement? Who defined what it means to be professional, how we should talk, how we should dress? Who defined, you know, this idea that being an individualist is better than being more communal, than being a collectivist? It's just thinking about how, like with Kristin and Rob said, how, yeah, you know, we can't just create reform because within the system itself, you know, this racist ideology is embedded within it. And so what we have to do is we have to dismantle. We have to dismantle and recreate. And so I just wanted to add, you know, that thinking about what people are saying and how these are just a lot of tenets of white supremacy. And that's how it shows when it comes to the question in particular, showing that, you know, what research is more valued and what research isn't.
Great. Yeah, so there are questions coming in basically asking, how do we address this? What is the systemic change that needs to be made, and how do we do it? How do we address that specifically within social and personality psychology? So I think we should definitely, you know, discuss those difficult questions. But there's one question that came up that I wanted to get in there at this point, that was submitted anonymously, which I believe will be primarily for Trish and Linda. It says, what steps are the white women in this panel taking to end structural racism and social psychology? And how are they holding their fellow white people in the field accountable? Yeah, Linda.
Okay, yeah. You know, I mean, I try to do my part, and then I feel like whatever I do is never enough. But just to give you a flavor of some of the types of things that I try to do in my regular practice, I do my best to try to conduct research that's directly relevant to these issues. Actually, some of our most recent work in my lab has been looking at how to motivate white people to care about racial justice. and to take action for racial justice. And anyone who's interested, feel free to send me an email if you're interested in reading some of those papers. I do my best to try to incorporate the perspectives of a variety of racial and ethnic groups into my scholarship, both in terms of my theorizing as well as the samples that I work with. I have mentored and continue to mentor a number, not only graduate students and postdocs, but just early career scholars of color, as well as first gen folks. And I would say not only those in my lab, but also those that I've met at professional meetings or at like those mentoring lunches at different conferences who, you know, we kind of talk there and then we kind of keep in touch to, you know, so I can continue to play a role as an informal mentor, or they can kind of like check in with me about things as they wish. Over the past year, and this is more local, it's not in social and personality psychology, but in terms of helping to nurture the future generations of scholars, I've been working with my university's Office of Equity and Inclusion to lend my scholarly expertise and my data analysis skills to analyzing campus climate data that we have to try to understand what predicts, not just using like for a report, like descriptive statistics, but actually trying to look at what predicts a sense of belonging and inclusion among students on campus, and how those feelings of belonging and inclusion might differ for white students and students of color. And then speaking also to some of the points that were raised previously about needing to look at context. We're in the process of trying to merge the zip codes where students come from to their campus climate data so that we can not only look at whether there are similar or different patterns for white students and students of color, but to also see the extent to which where they come from being highly segregated versus relatively integrated communities at all shapes who feels included, who has contact or doesn't have contact, to what degree that contact is positive or negative on the college campus, and how that fuels into feelings of belonging or exclusion. You know, I'm also asked to, you know, facilitate or co-facilitate racial bias workshops. We also, at our university, have just hosted a series of conversations separately for faculty, students, and staff, just among white faculty, students, and staff, where we watched Tim Wise's White Like Me and then had discussions about it. And I have to say, I was actually impressed by how engaged these white faculty that I facilitated were in the discussions. Even though they varied, some have been very involved in this work for a long time, and some are really new to it, and it's like mind-opening for them. And then, you know, folks who know me know that I care a lot about public engagement, so I try to disseminate this work broadly. But, you know, my personal view is we all have to find the actions that make the most sense for us. Like, I feel like everyone has a contribution to make. There are only so many hours in the day. So, you know, I go to my protests, but like, I also really focus my energy on things that relate to my scholarship that I feel like I can contribute. And so I would encourage everybody to think about what makes sense for them to contribute. And when I say everybody, I mean my fellow white folks.
Great. And before we turn over to Trish, I just wanted to say, I think, you know, you two, Linda and Trish, are certainly, you know, amongst doing, you know, a lot of this work in your research and your teaching and the levels of service that you do. And so, you know, I think it's really terrific. And that also that the issue of like, what can we do? What should we be doing to be anti-racist is sort of like, as Linda would say, everybody's issue. We all need to be thinking about this. So other panel members should also feel free to chime in on this question as well. But to move on to Trish.
So, I mean, it's a really important question, and I do a lot of the things that Linda does, right? You know, in terms of my scholarship, in terms of service and all of that. But what I've been doing lately is really trying to critically examine why we haven't made more progress. I mean, why are we where we are? Why is it that we call some things specialty topics and marginalize, you know, those issues. And I have just been engaged in conversations with my colleagues asking not quite the blow up question, how do we blow up the system and reconstruct it, because we do need to at least I don't know, shake it up a little bit. I mean, probably we do need to dismantle it in some ways, but we also have to function. So how are we going to make progress? So the university is going to be an entity. What can we do specifically to make adjustments? Everyone and across universities said, well, what we now need to do is we need to hire more scholars of color, and particularly Black scholars. And we do. But there'll be tremendous competition. How can we make the University of Wisconsin, right in the middle north of the country, a welcoming environment? I mean, so that if people were to come, if we were able to recruit, that people would feel as though they could function, thrive, and succeed in that context. You know, we've been satisfied, and I find Rob's analysis really compelling. We've all benefited, and I've benefited from a system that values the kind of work that I learned to do when I was in graduate school, right? Which is to do careful experiments and try to control for variables and, you know, do all of those things. But, you know, the question we were asked was, well, what can SPSP do as an organization to broaden the opportunities? That's going to require that we get leaders in positions that make those kinds of decisions that broaden what is acceptable, you know, and we've done it in small ways, but we haven't done it completely. So I'm trying to figure out ways we can at least effectively shake up the system, shake up our, you know, our complacency with how we've been functioning. I mean, how is it at the University of Wisconsin in the year 2020, we have one Black scholar in our department, and we're a small department, but we have one. We have 2 Black graduate students, I think 3 brown graduate students, and then we have a few other people who represent intersectionality. But how has that come to be, and why aren't we doing better so that we could push ourselves to think about those kinds of issues? I've been trying to read more broadly. I've been talking with more people, trying to educate myself on what needs to change in order for us to function more effectively as an organization, to be more welcoming to diverse perspectives. I thought a lot about graduate mentoring. You know what I learned about mentoring? Teach people to design a good experiment. Collect those data, analyze them well, and write a really clear paper. That's what it means to succeed. But I didn't think about issues of how to help people learn how to succeed, you know, in environment. If they did those things, if they did a good experiment and they did, you know, the right things, that would be the equivalent of success. And I don't think that we've thought carefully enough about what mentoring, you know, what mentoring means. Every student, I've always thought every student has different strengths and yet to be developed strengths, I like to call them. But I haven't thought enough about the unique challenges that some students experience that I don't know that I have a full window into. So we have to open up our conversations. There was another question that says, how do we have these conversations? And one of the things that you're going to need to do if you're a white, you know, person is recognize you don't know everything, that you have to be vulnerable. Some of those conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but it will probably be in the best service of the students and the broader community if we're willing to have those conversations, understand what the challenges are so that you can become a more effective mentor to make sure that you're attending to whatever those challenges are. So the things aren't earth-shattering, but they are things that I've had to come to an increased understanding as long as I've been in this field, and it's a long time. I don't think I yet fully understand the issues, and it's incumbent upon me to get better educated, to better understand the issues, and to be open to continued development.
So Trish, you've mentioned a lack of diversity. You've mentioned a lack of ability to effectively mentor across differences, let's say, you know, and and other things, of course, as evidence of these problems. And this is related to some questions that came in from the SPSB Student Committee and also some that are coming in from our audience today, particularly about how these systemic racism and other biases are reflected in social psychology and personality psychology, even within SPSP itself. How do we see it? How do we know it's there? What are examples of it? And then, of course, what can we do? What are the important actions that need to be done in order to address all of those?
Was that to me? Or
to anyone.
Oh, to anyone.
Yeah.
So you said a lot of things. I'm not sure I got.
Okay, I guess I'm basically saying what are the ways that systemic racism is seen in social and personality psychology, and what are the steps we need to take to do something about that?
So the first thing I'd say is I don't think it's seen. And I think this is partly maybe what Rob was saying, that we have to actually open our eyes in a new way to see the bias as it's experienced by others, right? We can see it in underrepresentation. We don't have enough people in the field contributing to the conversation to diversify the voices and the perspectives. I mean, I think that alone tells us that we're not seeing where the problems are. I mean, having served in the leadership of the organization now in many years gone by, I know it's been a topic of concern and interest of the society to think about these issues and to try to work on them, to create opportunities to invite more scholars of color to young people to the conference and to have diversity events and so on. But these can't be just one-off events. This has to become part of our lived experience day in and day out, that we're thinking about these issues and we're working on these issues. It's good to have events. I mean, those are great things to do, but I think we have to alter the way that we think about what we're trying to accomplish in terms of the nature of our faculty, the graduate student body. I think it was, I don't know if it was Rob or James who said that when they were young scholars, they didn't see people like themselves in the academy, and that was somewhat limiting. You know, we have to work to change that representation so that the younger generations of people have people who look like them and are, interested in similar kinds of issues. But, you know, it's not the case that all Black people want to study issues related to people of color. We want to create opportunities where people can study the questions that are interesting to them, but then create opportunities where they're full participants. And I do think that we have, for too long, been satisfied if we got one person. And I just said, not good enough, and asked the question, what can we do differently? I don't know that we have all the answers, but we have to start by asking the question.
Mm-hmm.
Does
know what the issue is and the problem first.
Does SPSB have a mission statement?
Yes, that would be on the spsb.org website.
I wonder if it reflects what we're talking about.
Pieces of it do. There are certainly a commitment to diversity is part of that overall statement.
Yeah, but
yeah,
commitment to diversity doesn't. That brings up another kind of related point. I think that we have, one of the issues that we have is that diversity has become a language that has subsumed race in certain ways. And the kinds of issues that have been, we talk this as a racism pandemic, and diversity is orthogonal. Well, not orthogonal, but it's different from that. And I think that somehow we have to find a way to do both. I'm a big both and kind of person. I just read today or yesterday a piece by William Fry about the fact that in the last decade, white Americans have reduced in number, absolute number, by 16,000 people. It's the first time in our history that whites have actually reduced in number. They actually reduced over 1 million, but there were a million or so white immigrants who supplanted them. Latinos increased by 10 million. Asian Americans by 4.5 million. Blacks by 3.5 million, and so on. So diversity is only going to increase, and those numbers are even more stark in the age group under 25. So we're looking at a future that's going to be increasingly diverse, and racism is going to mean different things to different people. So we have to understand, I think, how a racism analysis, which is part of our historical DNA, is juxtaposed to and not usurped by a diversity analysis, which is something that we have to also deal with. So I think somehow a conceptual approach that allows us to look at social justice, fairness, all the variables we've been looking at, but from multiple lenses at the same time, is something that we really have to do. And I wonder if that complexity is reflected in the mission of SPSP, and maybe kind of looking at it in a more complex way. And it involves major tinkering. You don't have to blow up the organization, but you do have to tinker with it majorly. It sounds a little bit like Donald Trump's, excuse me, to get that. So I think that in response to the question of what can SPSP do, what can we do with the field, I think those are the kinds of things that we really have to think carefully about and do something with.
Kamiya, did you have something?
Yeah, I do. I actually want to say that I think that the ways in which racism shows up in academia, that it's very apparent. It's very visible. It's right in our faces. I think what happens is that people don't go to that next step of like acknowledging it. And then who do go to the next step of acknowledging it, don't go to the next one, which is developing an action plan. And those who do go to that step don't go to the one afterwards, which is actually, engaging in that, plan and making sure that you're doing what needs to be done to make these changes. And so that's one thing that I would say is that like, it's there. We just had that question showing that like what is valued in academia, thinking about that, the PhD, the professor, pipeline, thinking about, the lack of transparency when it comes to being in a PhD program, and thinking about our milestones, thinking about the lack of transparency and getting tenured and how that can bias people based on their race. Just there's a lot of different ways people can go back to their departments and look around and see, do we have, a diverse representation of people based on race and other, identities. And so I think that people just have to go through those steps. It's right in your face. What you have to do is like, you really don't have to go far to seek out for it, but go to the next step of acknowledging that there are issues and there are problems, and then create a plan, especially if you are in a position of power. I think, people have been hearing, and it's really important to say that you need to make sure that people within marginalized communities are being engaged in that plan. They're helping you develop those plans, but I don't think that you need to wait until like Black people are in those positions in order to start anti-racism work. What you need to do is, with the power that you have, start engaging in it. And also, someone brought up, this idea of like comfort and being vulnerable. And I think that if there's anyone out there who is comfortable in the anti-racism work you're doing, then you're not doing enough. You should never get to a point where you're comfortable. Rob started off by saying something to the extent of like, he's not optimistic right now or something. And I'm sure Rob is doing some amazing things, when it comes to anti-racism work. And even I do so much, but I'm still never comfortable. I still think about it before I sleep when I wake up. And so that's something we have to think about. Yeah, doing the research, that's great. But you also have to look within yourself. You also have to think about, you know, these positions of power that you have in these systems and how you can change it, and how, and it just, that this is just like a continuous process that we all have to do.
And I think a lot of it lies in the hands of the people who are in power right now, right? I mean, they're the ones who can implement the needed changes, but they just have to do it. Right? More common, Kristin or Rob, or?
So I was just going to go off of something that James said, and also Kamiya and Rob at this point, having to do with like how we talk about diversity. And I picked up my phone so I could look up this article by Joyce Bell called "Diversity in Everyday Discourse: The Cultural Ambiguities and Consequences of Happy Talk." So we've talked ourselves into a way of diversity being this flowery, kumbaya, let's come together moment, without calling a thing a thing. In order for us to move forward and really heal and really find restoration, we have to speak the harm and call the thing a thing. We got to be honest about it. So what Robert, that whole system that he explained there, that is systemic racism. Let's call it what it is. Or as Kamiya said, that's white supremacy. Let's call it what it is. It's right there and it's apparent. And step one is us calling these things what they are. Step two, as Kamiya was talking about, is for those people in power, people that have positions like Rob and I, setting the standard for our institutions and changing things internally. So James said something about infiltration. We have the power, diversity officers have the power to change the rhetoric and the narrative about what tenure and promotion looks like. We can start to lead that charge. And as top institutions change the way that they're evaluating people, this PhD to professor pipeline will look different. We have the power to do that. We just got to do it. But that equals giving up some of the privileges that we have and calling a thing a thing. And we're not ready to do that because we're caught up in happy talk.
I can agree with that. And let's go to Linda and then Rob. And then after that, I think we'll probably have time for one more question from the audience.
Thanks. You know, I just wanted to follow up briefly on something that Kamiya was emphasizing, which is that, you know, the problems, the structural problems associated with racism are evident, are visible, are palpable. They're right there. And I think, at least in terms of our scholarship and how we think about our institutional structures, you know, we often do go into this diversity frame, which is like, oh yes, we need to bring in more people, and not necessarily address the relational and structural dynamics that are involved when you have more differences among the groups of people in a given institution or in a given space. And one of the things that I think about a lot, and that, you know, I think about before I go to bed, keeps me up at night, is how so many people, and, you know, I would say white people in particular, and especially, you know, people in power, don't notice the things that are evident to people of color. And, or if they do notice, don't care or don't prioritize. It's not as important as other things. And so I think one thing that I would just encourage all of us to really think about is, why is that? Why is that? And what can we do about that? And I see, you know, there's been a lot of research on this threat, you know, with the shifts in population, but I think there's more. I don't think it's just threat that people of color are taking over the country. I think there's more. And I think, you know, Rob talked about dehumanization early on in this conversation. I think that's a big part of it. And I found myself in my own thinking moving from simply thinking about the prejudice literature to the dehumanization literature and what is similar or different when we adopt those lenses. So I just wanted to throw that out there as we talk about issues to address.
And Rob?
I would also like to sort of jump in on this in the first start with the initial question of what can SPSP do? I think it is extremely important. SPSP can look at the way in which it currently acts as an organization across the board, from awards, presentations at conferences, to its publications, and look and see who's being published, who's being honored, who's being admitted in the process, and why, and what is the criteria that is there, and how is that criteria limiting and reinforcing structural inequality. And to do it, not to be anti-racist, but to do it because that's the only way you're actually going to have the best social psychology or the best personality psychology you can. You can't have psychology as a field understanding human behavior when you're only studying 4% of the population and their experience and assuming that that is capturing the way the world works. The interesting thing about our limitations is not only are Black folks damaged, but also everybody else is damaged too. Our science is impoverished. It's not as helpful to addressing society's problems as it potentially can be. It's not particularly helpful in really defining our understanding of our underlying constructs around how humans behave, because we are limited. So forget the politics or the feeling of good or bad, we're just doing poor science. Mm-hmm. So when we decide we're going to determine whether or not we're going to promote somebody based on a citation index, that's just anti-intellectual, because it's a paper that's in this journal versus that. The journal has nothing to do with the quality of the work. We all can read. And if what we're saying is we'd rather count than read, then what we're really saying is we don't have the ability to actually evaluate what's good and what's not good. And the reality is we need to expand what it is that we're doing if we're serious as a science in terms of who we bring in and who we don't. The other point that gets to Kristin's point too, and a little bit to James as well, is this notion that it's not diversity, and it's also not demographic changes that's going to matter. Demographic changes aren't going to change structure. We've been changing for nearly 50 years in terms of those demographic changes, and we keep thinking that we're going to get to a tipping point and that's going to result in change in power. The reality is power is concentrated at the top in such a small level that you will continue to have disadvantages where you'll have the minority leading the majority, i.e. South Africa. So it's not going to be about demographic, it's about equity, inclusion, and justice. And those last three, along with diversity, all require a redistribution of power and influence and privilege. And if we're not willing to do that, then we're playing at it. That's the bottom line here. So another thing that, and this is my last point, and I'll try to be quiet, I'm sorry to have gone on, that SPSP can do concretely is not as a organization, but as every single member of SPSP. We often as faculty look to administration and our leaders as if they're the ones that determine. There is no profession, no position in the world that has as much power and privilege as we do as faculty. Faculty hire other faculty. Administrators don't. President of institutions don't. So when those decisions about who's being hired happens, it's faculty. Faculty determines who gets promotion and tenure. So when we evaluate whether or not somebody should be tenured or not, it's not administrators. It's not, no matter what programs Kristin and I or others put in place, ultimately it's the faculty decision. And so as a group, when we go back and we're in the room where it happens, what are we doing? What are we saying? It's faculty who determine what the curricula looks like. Who is in your syllabus? How are you defining the field of social and personality psychology? Are you defining certain people out and other people in? SPSP has all the power in the world, not under SPSP, but in terms of each and every one of us. So we can each, at the end of this webinar, go back and take a look at all the things that our voice can make an impact in our particular department. And if each and every one of us makes an impact in our departments with our voice, with our privilege, when we're looking at graduate admissions, what are we looking for? Where are we looking for it? If we do that, now we start making that systemic change as an individual. So
that's terrific, Rob. And all these points you were just making are topics of conversation that we hear at the University of Michigan campus, I think largely due to your influence there. So it's great to we should end on this point about everyone being able to take home that. What are we doing locally? How are we bringing this to light, starting right with our own colleagues and then moving out through our larger networks, our larger departments and larger university. We are going to have to wrap things up because we're coming to the end of our time. There were a lot of really good questions that we didn't get to. One of them was upvoted a lot about guiding discussions with students around this topic, and especially the challenges of doing that when we're all remote, or many of us are remote. And these are all such good questions that we don't, certainly can't get through today, but SPSB is planning to keep offering webinars on different topics. And certainly that question about diversity-related content, anti-racist content in teaching would be something that would be of interest. So for right now, I'd like to wrap things
Denise,
up.
Can I just add one tiny thing? Because what Rob was suggesting and what Kamiya was suggesting, and really maybe Kristin as well, with some of the things is, it's one thing to start an initiative and you take a step, and Kristin was saying, go the next step. You got to have systems of accountability so that you can evaluate whether that you're making progress. And so I think part and parcel of having some intentions and identifying some actions is then to have some way to evaluate whether you've made progress, whether it be the organization of SPSP or evaluating your course syllabi or, actions within departments, or even as an individual, did I follow through? What is the evidence that you can do that? I think that that's an important component of all of this.
I agree. And that's, at least at the program level, that's what keeps them going, right? I have evidence that this is a successful initiative, and so yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So anyway, we covered a lot of ground today. I think that there were a lot of excellent points raised by the audience, by the panelists. And I really appreciated everyone's candor, their enthusiasm to discuss all these issues. And I'm glad to belong to this organization that allows us space to have these kinds of conversations. I'd like to say at this point in history, we're all experiencing this range of often very intense feelings, right, including uncertainty and anxiety and anger and outrage. But we can remind ourselves that as social and personality psychologists and scholars and in related fields, we're among those that are really taking the lead in addressing the racism pandemic through our research, teaching, administrative leadership, and importantly in our activism, things that we're trying to do to ourselves and our institutions. So as members and friends of SPSP, I hope we can use these conversations as starting points that will inform the next steps that we take, right, as an organization, but also as citizens of the world to work towards a more just and egalitarian society. So I'd like to thank the panel again for sharing their expertise and insights and their experiences. And also to thank the audience, thank all of you for joining us today and sharing your questions and perspectives. We will make a recording of this program available for future reference on the website spsp.org. And I know there were many questions that we wanted to get to today that we didn't, and that people who are watching this right now on the recorded version of this also didn't get a chance to submit questions. So please remember that SPSP is always open to your input. So feel free to follow up with us over email at spspinfo@spsp.org. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.